Okay, hi everyone. So welcome to our final panel, the Whiteness of British Poetry. We're going to have each of our panelists speak for about 5-ish minutes, and then we'll open up to general discussion and questions. At 6 o'clock-ish, rather than doing any concluding remarks, we'll hand over to Sophie Mayer and Elizabeth Jane Burnett, who will do sort of collect some responses and ask us some questions and sort of lead us through something together at the end. And they'll explain more about that at 6. So I'll just read some bios quickly. So Dorothy's going first. Oh no, yeah, Dorothy. So Dorothy is the author of Thinking Its Presence, Form, Race and Subjectivity in Contemporary Asian American Poetry, which was the basis for the first conference on race and creative writing held in the United States. She also curated the online Symposium, Race and the Poetic Avant-Garde in Boston Review. She teaches at Williams College in Massachusetts and sort of the founder of this project. Robert Hampson, who is also core member of this project, teaches at Royal Holloway. Sorry, there is a lot of Robert Hampson is Professor of Modern Literature at Royal Holloway, University of London, where he teaches on the poetic practice pathway to MA in creative writing. During the 1970s, he co-edited the poetry magazine Alembic with Ken Edwards and Peter Barry. Recently, he has co-edited with Ken Edwards the volume of Serious Reminiscence, Class, Late Modernist Poetry in London in the 1970s. Sandeep is co-director of the Centre for the Study of Sexual Dissidence and lecturer in English at the University of Sussex. His current critical book project, Poetry and Social Reproduction, Lyric Pedagogy and Marxist Feminism, reads 20th century and contemporary British poetry through the lens of social reproduction. And Sandeep Parmar, who some of you will have heard reading last night, is senior lecturer in English literature at the University of Liverpool. Her research interests are primarily British and American women's writing of the early 20th century, modernism, women's autobiographical writing, innovative and avant-garde 20th century and 21st century poetry in English. You might have read some of her recent excellent articles, which you might be talking about, in the Not a British Subject, in the LA Review of Books. So Sandeep has been a very important contributor to some of these discussions we're about to have. So I think we'll start with Dorothy.
Okay.
Thanks.
So about 5 minutes, so it's going to be really fast. First of all, I actually have one copy of my book that I brought, and if anyone wants to buy it, I don't want to carry it back. Okay, originally this panel was sort of conceived of as sort of our talking about how the group came about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then Robert's going to talk further background. First of all, I want to acknowledge all the people who've done work in Black British poetry, race studies here in Britain. A lot of work. I mean, this is not the first gathering to ever talk about race in poetry, but within this context, I just want to say how this came about. It had a much more sort of academic focus originally and sort of focusing on small presses. But I'm really happy that today actually we've broken down all sorts of barriers and all sorts of people have come together. So it's really been broad and wonderful and sort of varied. The sort of immediate idea for this conference actually came out of a sort of scene of trauma at a conference on the lyric at Cambridge in 2012 called The Shape of Song. I don't know if anyone was there. I think David was there. David was interested. So it was a conference on the lyric, which is a very broad topic at Cambridge, run by I think Simon Jarvis. The keynote was Jonathan Culler, and there are a lot of Cambridge experimental poets there, people who worked with Jeremy Prynne. And so I had submitted a paper on thinking about race in the American lyric, and I sort of expected that I would be the only person of color at the conference presenting, and probably the only person speaking on race. And I think I was the only person of color in the room for 2 days. And the audience was pretty big. It was like, I think about 70 people. It's pretty big, yeah. So my sense was, I was on this panel and I sort of was speaking about race, and it was not about British poetry at all, but about American poetry, but there was a sense of just like, it was as if I had taken a dump in the middle of the room. I mentioned the word race, I mean, just the vibes of like, I mean, it was really palpable. And then I thought, okay, this is really weird, because my advisor, and actually Sam's advisor, we share an advisor, but we're separated by many years, is David Lloyd, who is Irish, has written on post-colonial stuff, Irish stuff, minority literature. He's a product of Cambridge, and I kind of went thinking it was going to be at Cambridge, you know? And then I asked someone, and they said, oh, those are the post-colonial people, it's a separate group. So this was a siloing effect of sort of poetry studies and post-colonial studies. And I should say that there was receptivity from graduate students, queer poets, women poets. Zoe Scully was there, and she came up to me, she's like, oh, thank you for talking about this. This is the same problem we're having with gender, and had, you know. So it wasn't that everyone in the room was unreceptive, but mostly the big sort of figures in what I assume is a sort of certain strand of the avant-garde here in the UK, which is that Cambridge school coming out of print. So that's the, and then I had gone and given a talk at Robert's Contemporary Innovative Poetry Research Seminar in 2011, and he was enormously receptive, and Nisha was there. And so then I started thinking, well, maybe we should at least, and this stuff blew up in the US around race, as some of you know, like race and poetry became this really, I mean, in this last year, just the conversations blew up. And then it just seemed like, well, maybe it would be good to talk about it in the UK, and I heard Sam, and then we brought on Nat and Nisha and Robert, and everybody's been wonderful, so it's a collective thing. So I would want to say that if anyone's interested in joining the group, it's going to be an international sort of group, research group. People should go to the website, right? Send an email. But I also wanted to talk about not only the immediate genealogy of this group, but actually my thinking about the revisionist literary histories of the avant-garde and of actually the poetic tradition. And what I've been thinking about a lot is not only the history of modernism, which puts Harlem Renaissance to the side as a kind of black phenomenon, you know, and not as a part of like high modernism, right? So you have high modernism and then the Harlem Renaissance. And then actually thinking about Asian American poets who were very influential on modernism, including Yone Noguchi, who was the father of Isamu Noguchi and translated haiku into English and was a big influence on Pound, you know. And someone even further back, a lot of people know about, a guy named Sadakichi Hartman, who was half German, half Japanese, who worked in the late 19th century and was supposedly a secretary to Walt Whitman and knew a bunch of people, Stieglitz. I think those histories have really been written out. I mean, these non-white figures in modernism and in the history of the avant-garde, certainly in the United States. And more recently, I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between Ed Dorn and Amiri Baraka, because there's a new volume of letters, a really wonderful volume of their correspondence over the years, mainly in the 60s. And of course, Dorn was an important influence on Prynne, who of course was in the States for a little while. And then Prynne was actually the tutor for David Lloyd, who was our advisor. So there's this odd link there. But it turns out that, you know, today when we think about Dorn and Baraka, Dorn has a very exalted position in the white avant-garde in the States. I assume here, I don't know if he's well known here. But Baraka is seen as like a really good poet, but kind of crazy, like a black militant who went off the deep end. You know, who was part of black arts in the 60s and 70s, but then became increasingly sort of irrelevant. But if you actually look back at this correspondence, and Peter and I were talking about this earlier, Baraka was enormously central to avant-garde movements in the 50s and 60s. The New York School and the Beats, San Francisco Renaissance. I mean, he was everywhere, and he was really central. He wasn't a sideline figure. And he's actually the one that Dorn was writing to, sort of supplicating to get him published. And Baraka is the person who first published Dorn. And a lot of that history gets forgotten, and I want us to really think about the ways in which avant-garde poetic histories and poetry histories in general get written, to sort of, to really whitewash it. Right? And the other thing I'll say before I end is that I think, and I said this earlier in just the Q&A, I think it's really important for us to think about foundational concepts of poetry and poetics and sort of structural issues, not so much, I'm not really interested in like calling out people who are or are not racist. I'm really not interested in that, whether like Marjorie Perloff is a racist or Kenneth Goldsmith is a racist doesn't really interest me, but really to think about the ways in which we think the structural institutions, the concepts, the foundations of what we think of when we talk about poetry and poetics. It's aesthetic categories, notions of the poetic speaker, as I said earlier, just like our modes of reading, like new criticism, close reading, and why it is that, you know, post-colonialism and the history of like slavery gets sort of separated from thinking about, critical race studies get separated from thinking about aesthetics and poetry, which is really ridiculous. I mean, one thing David Lloyd did say to me as someone who isn't American, I remember at one point he said to me, it's really weird that in the United States, only the minority poets are expected to talk about race and not the white poets. He's like, because race has been such a central and important aspect of American history, so why isn't everyone writing about it? And I think it's hard for Americans actually to see that, you know, and so it took someone who's Irish to actually point that out. And I thought that was, for me, a very eye-opening moment. But anyway, I'm going to hand it over to Robert.
Thank you very much. One of the few advantages of getting old is that some of the things that you've passed through have become kind of history. And what that also means is there's a kind of lost history as well, to become what you were talking about earlier. And one of the lost histories, or potentially lost histories, is that of the non-Cambridge avant-garde, particularly in a kind of international context. So when Hannah was talking earlier, and we've talked about this since then, because she knows about this, about the performance, the body, breath, and so on. One of the things that in London we were very interested in the 70s was the work of Charles Olson, which is a body, breath-based poetics. And at the same time, one of the other things going on in London was Bob Cummings writing Writers' Forum, very much to do with sound, performance, the body. One of the differences, I think, between, or my sense, at least from where I was standing, between London and Cambridge was that emphasis on performance and body in the London world. What I was going to do, though, is present a kind of timeline through a series of snapshots of particular moments between 1963 and 1994, pretty quickly. And I'm conscious that this is a very particular, and in some ways a privileged perspective, and I'm conscious of things I probably couldn't see from that perspective. So the first one was about 1963, and this is northern working class white boys discovering the blues and discovering rhythm and blues. Memories of things like there was a television program, a television play about the death of Bessie Smith and the implications of the death of Bessie Smith. Also hearing Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, or Adrian Henry's poem called Me, which has the subtitle, If You Weren't You, Who'd You Like to Be? And it begins Paul McCartney, Gustav Mahler, Arthur Jarry, John Coltrane, Charlie Mingus, Claude Debussy, and then goes on to a various people, including Bessie Smith, Miles Davis, and Martin Luther King. Jump 10 years then to 73, and when I set up Alembic with Ken Edwards and Pete Byrie, and we set this up consciously as an anti-sexist, anti-racist, with that policy. In the early years, we approached Linton Kwesi Johnson with an invitation to send us some poems, but he turned us down. He said he'd given up writing poetry. For the first two issues, we invited contributions. Subsequently, a proportion of what we published came through the mail, because this is all pre-internet. And also pre-internet, we had no idea who these people were sending this stuff in to us. So stuff came in from the States. We published Emmanuel Rowe, was in Virginia, Ray Armitage, my person, Luga. No idea at all what the ethnicity was, because there was no way of finding that out. And equally, they had no sense of what our ethnicity might be either. 73, 74, we took part in a number of readings at the Troubadour, where we linked up with Mahmoud Jamal. We organised a set of readings at the University of London Union, and Mahmoud and his team came and read with us. 75, 76, Ken set up Share Publications to publish poetry pamphlets. One of the half dozen poets he published was Paul St. Vincent, which is a pen name for E.A. Markham. He was also one of the 12 poets who then read in the Future Events reading series that we ran at the White Swan in 76. But he was then taken up by the British Council, by the Arts Council, and commercial publishers, and we never saw him again. The same year, we also read with the American surrealist poet Ted Jones in a series at the Enterprise Museum. 1976 was also the year that the Arts Council under Charles Osborne set up the Wilt investigation into the Poetry Society, because it was being run by experimental poets. And the conditions that were then imposed by the Wood Report were followed by resignations by some of the avant-garde members of the Poetry Society Committee, and that was then followed by a mass walkout following the avant-garde members of the Society. That happened in 1977. The avant-garde, as Peter was saying earlier, wasn't supported by the British Council, still isn't. Wasn't supported by the Arts Council. With the withdrawal from the Poetry Society, the London-based avant-garde had lost any position of power, had no access to funds, etc., etc. The activities then took place in, as it were, non-academic spaces. Very quickly, a parallel lifeline and timeline. 1973, we included in the first issue of Alembic graphics by my first wife, Shabana Rajawari. At this point, Shabana was well-known in Bengal as a children's writer and illustrator of her own stories. She published in essentially children's magazine Shonda. During the 70s, she published short stories in Spare Rib. She was engaged in discussions in Spare Rib about feminism and women of colour. She did some work for Nassim Khan on Bengali language poetry, written and published in the UK, and some of her own work was taken up by Lem Sissi. She and I were also involved in translating contemporary Bengali poetry into English. We published some of these translations in Peter Barry's small press magazine Windows in '79. We published some in the TLS and some in the London magazine in 1980, but neither the TLS nor the London magazine published my work. In 1983, at an event organised by the Poetry Society and South Asian Literary Society, we were invited to read some of these translations, and that's the only time I've ever been invited to read at the Poetry Society since 1970. In '84, Shabana became involved with the Asian Women Writers Collective, along with Ruxana Ahmed, Lina Dingra, and other writers. She was writing both short fiction and poetry. An anthology of work by the collective, Right of Way, was published by Women's Press in '88. A second anthology, Flaming Spirit, was published by Virago in '94. So, and as well as support from these high-profile feminist presses, between '84 and '94, which is when the funding was taken away, the collective also had funding from the GLC, which allowed them to pay writers to run workshops and to finance a full-time writer in residence. Again, no such funds were available to the avant-garde. So far from being gatekeepers in this period, the avant-garde in London anyway had nothing to offer that could compete with that in terms of support from funding bodies or commercial publishers and so on. To bring those two timelines together quite quickly, 1988 saw the publication of this anthology, The New British Poetry, from Picador. Project by white gatekeeper John Muckle. It has 4 editors, 4 sections. The first is Black British Poetry, edited by Fred D'Aguilar. The second is quote, feminist, unquote, poetry, edited by Gillian Allnutt. The third is called A Treacherous Assault on British Poetry by Eric Mottram. And the last one is Some Younger Poets, edited by Ken Edwards. This anthology wasn't much reviewed. It's usually advocates of 20th century poetry anthologies, they usually jump over this one. The categories are interestingly problematic, but there is at least an attempt to bring together various poetry and various kinds of poetics. The launch event of the Poetry Society was a missed opportunity. Having brought together these groups into one place, there was no discussion, there wasn't reading a single poem, instead there was a long speech by someone from Victor celebrating the fact that we brought out this anthology, which they virtually, there were a couple of other avant-garde poetry volumes brought out by Muckle, and the whole lot were pretty well published by shortly afterwards. Finally, on the back of the anthology in 1994, Peter Barry and I persuaded Manchester University Press to bring out this collection of essays, The New British Poetries, which was the first mapping of the new poetries in Britain since the 1960s. The first chapter, which you used to hear, is the British Poetry Revival, 1960s, 1975, which I apologise for. This was a revised version of the essay that Eric Mottram wrote for the PCL conference in 1974, 20 years earlier, the first time it's been published since it was produced as a catalogue essay in 1974. The second essay was a new essay by Fred D'Aguilar called Having Been Here Long, Black Poetry. So far from excluding black poets, we at least we're trying to include them, but I'll stop
I'm going to speak in fairly broad strokes to give a different contextual account, or speculation really, might be more what it is. And one track of my research, and something that I'm just generally aware of in day-to-day work life, is, and this is obviously based on my position as a university lecturer, but is the extent to which the category of British poetry has been constructed in relationship to institutions of higher education, that has had a huge influence on how that category has been constructed. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about the relationships between UK poetry and institutions of higher education, and to think, or ask us to think about how the development of poetry as part of national curricula has always been racialized, albeit in different ways and varying ways. And I'll just forecast that one of the questions I have that I don't know that I can answer yet, and it's a genuine question, is about what happens to the racial dimensions of teaching English poetry in the shift from the domain of English literature as a subject of study to that of creative writing as a subject of, say, practice-based study. And I don't know. But that's a question that I want to engage. And before getting there, I want to mark up a couple of things. And the first is just that I certainly don't mean to suggest that everything that we call poetry or everything we've been talking about today comes from or even comes into contact with universities. That's certainly not the case. But I still think that the university has been a key node in the network of determinations of what counts as poetry, of what is read, of what is disseminated, all of those things. And likewise, in more circuitous ways perhaps, it's a place where race is constructed and reconstructed through universities, I think, as well. Perhaps that's a more complicated tracing to make. And I see that working in at least two levels. So one of them is through the development of English poetry as an apparently stable textual field, like body of text. Apparently stable, I say. And secondly, through that shift from literary study to creative writing, from a mode of learning how to appreciate great works to a mode of learning how to express oneself, perhaps. Those would be the dominant ways of describing those two fields of study. And I suspect, this is an overstepping, that the shift might have something to do with the management of what is now called like equalities and diversities, in the plural. Or at least in university admin managerial discourse, that is what it's called. And so firstly, just to elaborate that universities have been key sites for the production of English poetics as apparently stable field of reference. They've likewise been places for the distribution of credentialed literary competencies. Again, that's not the only basis for writing by any means, but it's a credentialed basis. And one very particular explanation for that has to do with the particular ways that the reading of poetry was institutionalized in the early and mid-20th centuries. And I think that ways of talking and thinking about poetry that were institutionalized in that period certainly remain with us, even as the conditions that gave rise to them aren't with us. So I would trace that as roughly the period between the Newbolt Report of 1921 that called for the growth of English literary study in schools and universities, through to, say, the Robbins Report of 1963 that called for the expansion and democratization of higher education and said that English had to still be a big part of that. The way that English poetry was supposed to be understood in that phase was, that it would help to secure the reproduction of British social and political relations by creating national identity, teaching people how to abstract themselves from their more material interests and have an not only intellectual but actually affective investment in this foreign piece of writing. That's what's meant to happen. so, you know, if you read I. Richards, he's not just saying you should interpret a poem, he's saying you should forget what you feel and feel this way. And that's how you can be ready to be a mature person. It's quite sophisticated. It's not, you know, and it may work, actually. I'm not sure. So you're supposed to be able to suppress particularity, be properly aesthetically and effectively appreciative. And obviously, again, as we've been saying all day, this has all sorts of dimensions of stripping off racialized, class, gendered, and other forms of difference, including bodily ability and all sorts of things. These things are completely meant to be abstracted away. But at least by the early 80s, let's say, these defenses of literary education are kind of unnecessary. The mass British working and middle classes don't really need to have this kind of sensitivity given the globalization of production and the decimation of domestic labor movement, offshoring of manufacturing work, all those kinds of things. So obviously there are other ways that literature has been talked about in universities, as we've talked about, through cultural studies, post-colonial literary studies, but they haven't necessarily made their way into how most people teach poetry, how to encounter a text, the exemplary appreciative moment. People could argue with that. So just quickly, I'll shift into the second set about the rise of creative writing courses, which takes place after, to some extent, the reading of poetry loses its pious, moral, and political justifications. So there's broadly a tendency to move from a national program of teaching people to read and appreciate poetry toward one of teaching and encouraging people also to write poetry. Often in expressive modes, I think that earlier understandings of poetry would have found like completely intolerable. I think, you know, this is a really contradictory development in all sorts of ways. Universities have, in this period that I'm describing, opened up, recruited many more working class people, migrants from former colonies, Vietnamese students. At the same time, the most obvious thing to say about the UK Academy is that it's sort of professionally white. I think that's fairly clear to most people. And in that sense, I think most writing about the sort of incorporation of minority difference in universities has come out of the US. It's like Roderick Ferguson's work on the incorporation of minority difference, where he can show that the post-68 university has incorporated minority difference through strategies of representation, changing curricula, having affirmative action programs for students, changing staffing numbers, those kinds of things. That critique isn't really available in the same way for the UK university, I don't think. I don't know exactly what to do with that, but I mean the critique of the incorporation of minority difference. There is an incorporation of minority difference in language, but things like diversity, that we might have very critical understandings of the way that diversity is a managerial discourse in all sorts of ways, remain in the context of the university completely. They skipped that step. They went straight to subsuming it without actually doing it. And that's a notable difference, I think, that, I don't know, that's sort of rambling. I'll stop there because I'm over time, but there's more to say.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah.
We've sadly had some news from security that we need to leave the building by 6 o'clock,
Oh,
which is about an hour earlier than we'd anticipated. So we were kind of thinking maybe, but like Sandeep, you should present your thoughts, and maybe we can run up until coming up, like maybe for 10 more minutes, and then we have to kind of pack up and leave. I'm really sorry, obviously, there's a miscommunication in the building management. But yeah.
okay, thanks for letting us know.
I'll be really quick. Okay. It's been such an amazing day, and I feel like so many important things that I would have said have been said better by other people. I love, with the conversations we had on the panel with Andrea and with Kaya, there were some really extraordinary things. We're going to have to disagree about mangoes, I'm afraid. But my perspective on all of this is as a poet, but also as someone who works within literary modernism, thinking about kind of canonical revision and the ways in which people become a part of the canon. And so as a writer, that makes me very conscious of the way in which we're marketized. And so coming from being born in England, raised in America, and then living here for 15 years afterwards, I have a very sort of divided sense of what it means to belong to any particular canon and where I fit. And actually what I've kind of realized, I think, is that I enjoy being displaced and I don't want to belong to a community. And what that has to do, for me, is really interesting because, and I think this is something that I've actively cultivated in various ways, is to be a part of an international conversation, even if I'm not actually talking to these people. And to read translation. I'm glad Stephen mentioned translation, that's great. And to look beyond these kinds of national paradigms of the way that we write and the way that we think. So I'm deeply suspicious of some of the ways in which we're thinking about diversity now and promoting diversity now. The prize culture, obviously, I think we're all sophisticated enough to think about that for ourselves. So all of this kind of came up around when Kathy Parkon's excellent article, Delusions of Whiteness in the Avant-Garde, came out. I wrote a brief response in a poetry magazine that I helped edit called The Wolf. And for me, it felt like a moment where we just had not had that conversation at all in Britain. And maybe that was just me keeping my eyes closed for many, many years and working with an entirely white institutions at Cambridge, at UCL, at UEA, where I was, and just always being the only brown person. And being published by a wonderful, sort of avant-garde press, I guess, Shearsman, and feeling as though there really weren't that many people of color on the list either. And so, moving on from that, I was asked, as part of I work with the BBC, I was asked to sort of do something. And I said, well, I'll talk about race in the avant-garde, and I did, and I had a little recording on the BBC of this back in May of last year. And I had to cut it down for various reasons, so all kinds of interesting things went. But in the Q&A afterwards, the presenter, who was Asian, said something like, but you've published 2 books? Are they well read? Are they well received? And I was sort of like, sure, yeah. And he said, what do you want? What more do you want? And I thought, well, you're totally missing the point. So I think this is the kind of expectation, why are you complaining? Why are you angry? What is it that you really want from us? For me, as a writer and as an academic, I want us to develop less patience for the ways in which writers are treated on the basis of their identity, and more robust criticism, and particularly within journalism. I think that the Sarah Howe situation is a very good example of this. And I think that conversation has begun. I'm very pleased that that's begun, but that needs to continue. And yes, so my LA Review of Books piece, which I mentioned earlier, was really about that, and yeah, that's great.
So we've probably got 5 minutes if you want some questions.
Right, so
I have a very quick question, and maybe we'll also think about reconvening in a nearby bar, which I will think about during the 5 minutes.
Yeah, we have to be up by 6, those were 15 minutes.
Yeah.
No, we have to
Out
out
of
of the
the
room.
Oh,
Yeah, as in they're going to lock us in at 6, which, would maybe work, but might have practicality difficulties. Yes?
This was a bit from what Sam was saying about curricula, but national curricula, especially secondary school education. I realise that if everybody is going to school in the States, then perhaps not ask the right people. But there is something sort of thinking, what would make a 14-year-old sort of think, I like language, I know poetry is the place where I'm going to get that. When you look at what 14-year-olds actually encounter, you think it's kind of amazing that any 14-year-old wants to become a poet who actually cares about language. But so I guess one of the things that maybe I should stop there with the joke. But so one of the things we spoke about a bit earlier was sort of history syllabi and what they do. But so to what extent is actually the literature syllabi itself going to be excluded, not to people like me, obviously, but that's going to be then some structural thing that when we then look at these other institutions such as the publishers and the universities, and I guess the publishers have a very close link to the syllabi because they make loads of money out of it. But that is another aspect that needs to be sort of thought through as kind of a structural whiteness or whatever.
I'll start. Yeah, did you?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a funny thing about syllabi, which is that I think, and this is just a sign of perhaps like, I don't think students are the problems in terms of syllabi. Like, and this is for better and for worse. If you're teaching, like, for the most part, unless they get an indication from another part of their curriculum, you give a syllabus and students, like, say, okay, that's what we're learning. I mean, that's been my experience. Unless there's some colleague or something who says, oh, that, you know? And then, I mean, I'm not saying that students don't question things, but that there is a pedagogical relation that they bring, even if you don't want it to be there very often.
But I'm talking about 13, 14-year-olds.
13, 14.
I'm
I
not,
think
I'm
that
not
would be...
talking about undergrads, I mean, that seems to be one of the major sort of problems.
Right, where you have a national curriculum.
We've
It's
got-
different.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
a national curriculum isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's national.
I think it was I don't know which Conservative Party conference it was, but David Cameron said that when he was talking about the syllabus, that, you know, we wanted to portray the island story in all its glory, you know, with the kings and queens and everything else. There's very little room in that for diversity, as we've discussed already. So, I mean, I suppose in an increasingly hostile culture, national culture towards difference, which is increasingly hostile, it's less likely under the Scotland that. Whether students can sort of go to the syllabus and say, this doesn't reflect my cultural experience, I very much doubt, and, you know, at a school level that's really possible.
The one thing I would add, I don't know if you've read, Danny Hayward wrote a piece about, it's quite complicated, but about about in 2014 when the English curriculum was being stripped of Americans and whatever else, and that there was a general outcry that this was a return to old values. And he makes a somewhat convincing argument that actually it's extremely of the moment in a very particular way, and that has to do with a kind of stripping away back to a text that is not really that interesting to you, and that the kind of engagement with that text resembles the kind of work that people are going to be asked to do. And so I think that is an interesting perspective on that. That doesn't answer your question about agency or change, but I mean, I don't know.
No, I think that's a really good point, yeah.
But I mean, sorry, actually, I'll shut up.
Can I ask a slightly inflammatory question?
Yeah.
Well, I picked up on what you said, Sandeep, about being angry. And as I was preparing for this event, I was conscious of, particularly in Claudia Rankine, of many stories of these sort of microaggressions of racism. And I somehow imagined that might come up. Now, I nearly played a clip from Matthew Paris's radio show where he does a famous life, and it was James Baldwin, and the person who was interrogating the life was Alvin Hall, who's an black American kind of very public figure who talks about economics. And he said, this is the thing that really stuck with me, Matthew Paris suddenly said, off message I thought, said, well, do you feel threatened, in your daily life as a black man? And he said, yes, every day in New York. And he said, when I come, he said, it's a relief when I come to England because there's so much less of that. And that, so I was thinking about America and Britain and so on. But I was also thinking about just that experience of being threatened, and Tommy Easy Coates talks a lot about that. So, sorry, I guess it's...
In terms of the difference between both countries?
Yeah, either both countries or just thinking about...
I mean, it's difficult because, of course, the experiences of one person are not going to be applicable to the experiences of others, and it's very hard to generalise. And I think the experiences of black people are different than the experiences of Asian people, particularly in this country, because they come from very different expectations in ways that, for whatever reason. Yeah, I suppose thinking about anger, it's definitely not something that is permissible, and I think it's that kind of, in a way. There's a poet who I think is writing about this, I won't say who it is, but he was saying that sort of British poetry creates a kind of space of where it kind of has an utterance but then retreats and is silent. And I think that is that ongoing problem of not engaging, whether it's politically or whether it's just to keep talking and to keep saying those things, to create that conversation. That's something that we lack. I think we don't have that in this country in the way that perhaps we do in the States. Personally, though, as a person of color in both countries. I didn't experience racism in the States in the way that I've experienced it here. That's just been my experience, living in both countries. I just didn't experience it that much when I was growing up in the States. I mean, even though I grew up in a very white, extremely white, entirely white town,
And I had a totally different experience growing up in the States. Because I grew up in the South, in a very small town in North Carolina. And,
Yeah,
it was speaking of Jim Crow, that picture he had, it was very Jim Crow actually. And so, and I haven't lived long periods in Britain, so. But I would say that actually as an academic, in Williams College is a small liberal arts college, it's a sort of elite college, but the level of microaggressions I've experienced actually in the university has been as bad as anything I experienced growing up in North Carolina. It was much more overt in the South. I mean, people are as hostile, they're hostile, they call you names, it's, it's not covered up. It's like, these are not people pretending that they know anything about, international travel, or, I mean, these are people who asked me things like, your English sure is good, when are you going back, where you came from, is your father Bruce Lee? I mean, these are people who really had never seen an Asian American or an Asian person. So, but in the university, actually, in this sort of space of like white liberalism, which Rankin writes about, it's just as horrible. But people are deluded into thinking that they're really progressive on race. And that's actually harder sometimes. The stories that one could tell. I mean, I taught at Northwestern before I went to Williams, and there was one moment at which a senior faculty person, I went into, she was having a party, and a few of the junior people went in, and I asked her a question. She didn't really hear me, so she asked me, did you just ask me if I want any opium? She literally said that, and I about fell up, my mouth dropped. It was just, like, she said that. She said, did you just ask me if I want any opium? Who pushes opium in life? It was like her unconscious just popped out. So I think that what Claudia Rankin writes about is actually I thought was very common. I mean, it happens every day in university, especially in English departments.
And I suppose just to make that relevant to poetry in a way, Claudia Rankin writes about that in her book, but would that be something that we would feel comfortable writing about at that level in Britain? And this is a question that has been asked by many people. Andrew as well wrote about this too, and I think that's worth considering. Why is that? How well would it be received if we did?
So we're really sadly going to have to close it there. There's a couple of things. If maybe we'll reconvene at the Tavistock Hotel, just because it's a terrible bar, but it has space. You'll know that. If you can help us, if a few people can help us stack some chairs, that'd be really great. If other people could leave, but also leave that